Hey, everybody. This is something a little bit different. We have an interview with Graham Nickerson, the Community Inclusion Liaison for the City of Fredericton. He was integral in developing the Atlantic Canada Hidden Histories tour. We have a couple of videos where we shared parts of this interview, but here it is in full, uncut, and unedited. I hope you appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks. Okay, so we are here at the Maritime Mega, and we have Graham Nickerson, who is the Community Inclusion Liaison for the City of Fredericton. Graham, can you tell us a little bit about what that role is?
So in 2021, the City of Fredericton opened the Office of Community Inclusion. And basically, it is trying to pivot the way that the municipal government engages with the public. And that we, in this area, traditionally a very white part of the country, but we have had a very drastic increase in newcomers to the region over the last 20 years, and definitely over the last 10 years. And so the methodology of government and engagement was not really suited to making really good decisions in terms of how the federal government settlement process, provincial services, and municipal enforcement, all of those things had holes in the way that they handled with newcomer communities. And so there wasn't really a mechanism either for those communities to report to the municipal government. So our office is really specifically designed to be available for not just newcomers, but all marginalized citizens, really, to engage with municipal government, feel that as they're dealing with me in particular, a non-white agent of the government, therefore the feeling is that communication could be a little more honest and that you're not like I know from personal experience, trying to explain a black perspective when you engage with, like, you know what racism looks like, right? It only has to, when you're talking to somebody and they're doing the old, like
Side eye.
the old look or whatever, or the tone, or the smirk, and you're like, oh yeah, right, I know what's happening here right now. And so people can have that conversation without having to go through the explanation of how they feel, why they feel the way they feel, and get more to, like, what can we do to address those pinch points in Fredericton society that make people feel disengaged from citizenship and government.
Great. And I guess one of the initiatives through that office is, since we're talking about geocaching, you've been recently involved in, or you're currently involved, I guess, in Hidden History's Geotour.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the tour itself and then your involvement and how you got involved with it?
Right. So Atlantic Canada Hidden Histories is an initiative started in Fredericton, but in cooperation with Nova Scotia as well, to do basically to convey histories of marginalized peoples and do it in the form of geocaching. So locations of significance to different communities would be based on historical significance, or, well, it could be current significance as well, but essentially to tell a story that in this part of the country tends to have been erased, actively erased. Like in this part of the country, there is a narrative, and it is very exclusive of non-white people.
Right.
So where do I fit in? Well, I'm my background is in geodesy and geomatics, so I often think in terms of mapping, much like I'm sure geocachers, it's a spatial awareness. Although in the talk I gave, I'm not sure that there's a lot of confidence in that skill set. But the basically then thinking of history as tied to place. And so here in Fredericton was originally settled by, originally it was the First Nation. So the Wolastoqiyik people and the Wabanaki. And so then you see, like, the Acadians settled here, and it's sort of this power struggle between Britain and Holland and France. But in 1783, after the end of the American Revolution, the Loyalists come. So those are the people who backed the British during the American Revolution are forced out of the 13 colonies, and some of them settle here and on Point St. Anne. But part of that population were black Loyalists, who were black, enslaved, or maybe not enslaved people, who joined the British, either served as labor or fought as soldiers for the British Army, and were allotted land, or were brought here as enslaved people to settle and be a source of labor. So the city has this sort of parallel non-white story, which is not only black First Nations, but also by early 1800s we have Chinese people coming in, which is why I asked you to try and black people here. It's a very black thing of like, who are you? What's your last name?
Of course.
What do I know about you? How do I fit you into what I know? Yep. And who are your people? That kind of thing. So we have this like very rich non-white story here, but it's been erased. And so what can we do to bring it back? The institutions, the structures, brick and mortar assets, all of that is gone. So all you have is like a story. Right. And a geographic space. And so that's what the Hidden Histories... It started as Fredericton's hidden black cityscape, but then we expanded it to the Maritime region in general. And so now we're looking at all of the provinces.
Great. I mean, you mentioned something in terms of, you're finding commonalities with people. And I find that for myself, even being Filipino, and not that we're like homogenous society or something, but when you're outside of anywhere and you see someone who is Filipino or you hear that language, you have a kind of a kinship, and you ask like in the Filipino community, we always ask like, where are you from in the Philippines? Because then you go, okay, well, that's the home province that my parents are from, or that was really far. But you can have different ways of having those relations. And I think when you're like a settler community outside of the Philippines, for example, and you come to somewhere like Canada, you're looking for that. We always have a kind of a term where you're like, you're looking for like home, kind of away from home.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's very much for us as well. It becomes locally, if you're not aware of sort of the historical part, it's like, who's your last name?
Sure.
Or what's your last name? What community are you from? And then from there, you can usually piece together their relationship to you.
Right.
And then if you go back and you're like, well, are you from Virginia? Are your people Virginian? Are they from Georgia?
Right.
And you can kind of start to tie in with the black populations that are outside of here, but in Virginia. And so, and that's all happening. Like, this is the thing, is that we all of us who are not European, we have this dialogue that most Europeans aren't aware of.
Right. You talk about kind of the historical significance and of the land as well, and kind of the geographical locations that someone might be able to learn about by going to like a cultural center or a museum or a plaque on a building. Why geocaching? Like, why the platform of geocaching?
Well, that's a good question. I'll try to be brief, although I haven't so far in my answers. But, well, the issue, first of all, we have to confront the colonialism built into heritage, right? And museums have traditionally been symbols of colonial power, right? That's how they're designed. If you look and you think, like, especially if you're older and you think back to being a kid, it's usually about, like, Britain did this and went there, and that's this thing is here because we went there and took it and brought it back.
Right. I mean, we just drove through Ottawa and Quebec City, and like that's the whole vibe, the whole history of that area is the colonial history, And,
so we did this, or we fought. Britain and France fought to take control of not only the land here, but the economic system that ties us to the Caribbean slave economy, and it's just a huge to the like it. Once you start to go down that rabbit hole, you're talking about like our discussion should be about Spain,
right?
Spain brought us all together, right? And English and Britain, like, they're very good. Britain is very good at like saying, "Oh no, that's not us. We're not like that." Right? Like, just read your grade 12 history reader. That's all you need to know.
Right.
But what if no? So you have to critically look at museums to be like, okay, the message has been Britain, the all-powerful, but then there's the switch over to, like, Canada is the inheritor of British power. And so the central government is a benevolent central entity that tells us for our best interest to do. And I'm not saying it as, like, I'm not a libertarian. I'm a historian who looks at, like, you pull down the British ensign and you raise the Canadian flag.
Yeah.
And the colonialism continues on. So now, how do you confront that? Well, when hopefully later on today, when you go to Salome's Well or Salome's Tub, that location, and I picked that one because it's fantastic. It's it personifies the beauty of geocaching, and that you can go into this region that's 20 minutes outside of Fredericton. Fantastic feature, and that's where the history happened. You can go and you can be right there, as opposed to, like, going to Fredericton and seeing a rendition third party that's been vetted and sanitized to portray a certain story. There's a story there for Salome's Tub, but that is both about black empowerment and enfranchisement, disenfranchisement, but a community that rose and fell and it's disappeared.
Yeah. For me, I think there's also something about being on the physical land, and being in that place and feeling the history. It might sound a little flighty, but kind of like feeling that history while you're there and knowing about it, rather than being in an off-site place like a museum or, like you said, sanitized, right? Like, being somewhere where there's history in the ground.
Right, right. It's like watching a historical adaptation of your history, and that was written and directed and funded by white institutions, and you look at it and you can barely recognize it. And what I had a very good point to make, and it went. Maybe it'll come back, and I'll say it. But basically, that's you have again the genuine story. So for me, there is the spiritual side, which isn't like I'm an engineer, so to me it's my escape and my way forward was to be like, because there is the black community in this region is very economically challenged. The indigenous black, which means the blacks from the 18th and early 19th century. So education is the way, right? And empirical. But there is this, through these projects and through history, I've reconnected with the spiritual side, the cultural remnants and spiritual remnants of Africa. And so to me, there is, and being in the place and touching the earth. And there is a feeling that I can only attribute to the ancestors. And it seems hokey when you haven't felt it. Yeah. But when you're at Salome's Well, you feel it. You'll feel like when I'm there and I see the water and I know, like, my ancestors viewed this medium of water as the pathway back to Africa. That is when you die in African tradition, some West African traditions, you immerse the dead in the water, and their spirit travels through the water across the ocean to be reborn back in Africa. And once you're part of it, you can't not be part of it anymore. So that ties me to it. I
got a little bit of chills as you said that. I think of the same thing from being from Vancouver, of the Pacific Ocean, as being that is like the same water that touches the Philippines. And so, and having that connection, just being out on the water and kind of feeling that connection to, and I was born in Canada, I was born in Montreal, but having the stories of my parents and the stories of family and friends, and feeling that connection, even though the distance is there.
Yeah.
What can people expect to find when they go onto these cache sites?
So when I conceived of the sites, like there are some sites that I picked out of family history or knowledge, and like that's a really cool piece of history that people should know, and doesn't live anywhere. There are those sites. Most of those are in Nova Scotia. The ones here in Fredericton, what we really tried to do is to work sort of within the city's expectations of how, like, central locations, things that people can access easily. There's still the shock of like, oh, like this was a black community and it's not here anymore.
Right. Hence the hidden history.
Hence the hidden. Yeah, exactly. There's like, I've met up with a guy named Roger Nason who's an archivist, and so we have this huge archive or catalog of sites that we want to add. That you just, it's like in between those two buildings, that used to be a black ghetto essentially, and it's like people need to know. But in Nova Scotia, for me, it's like I'll just tell you, you're not going to Nova Scotia that far, I don't think. But
no, we're going to mainly be in Halifax.
Area. There is the Sable River Servants, which is in our Louis Head Servants, which is in Louis Head, Nova Scotia, which is in the South Shore, and like way out in the middle of nowhere. And to me, it's like I want, like Salome's Tub, I want people to be in silence and have a chance to like give it the respect and thought that it deserves. And so for me, Louis Head, like my family so when slavery ended in Canada in 1834, it didn't really. What it did is transitioned into economic dependence. Yep. And so my ancestors, when they were basically they were servants through economic circumstances in which they couldn't escape. And so in Louis Head, there's a graveyard. And this is unbeknownst to me. I'm just looking at the graveyard looking for graves to see any ties to my family. But then there's like a little path down over the hill, and so I just sort of walk down over the hill and look, and there's on the ground there's a plaque, a handmade, like homemade plaque. And I go over and I look, and it's like, here is the resting place of Mary Bell, last of the Sable River servants. And it's like, this is what they mean, are the last of the enslaved Africans who lived here serving wealthy ship owners in that area. And there's the only reason I know and why I was there looking is that my great aunt lived there with a black sailor from St. Martin's in the Caribbean.
Wow.
And she had a baby who died. He died at sea, and then she lost her baby in like the stretch of the same year. And it's buried somewhere around that graveyard. So this, like, my ancestors are buried there with no markers, and it's profound, right? That thing you can't just shrug it off and be like, oh, I'm unchanged. Oh, look what time it is, and you have to carry that around. And what do I do? How do I ensure that that's maintained? And so the hope is that people who do go to that site, hopefully people who in your audience who end up out there, or you yourself, if you get a chance, is you're there. It's a beautiful location. Those in my mind are the perfect spots, because you get to stand there. You're like, you can hear the ocean is crashing against the shoreline just 100 meters away, and you have space and time to just sit there and think about like the people who came before us, our ancestors, right, who got us here, and who had to put up with a system that didn't appreciate them. But here we are, and now we get to share it with more people, so everyone understands sort of when we talk what we're saying.
I kind of wanted to give that just the time to kind of sink in. What has been the impact so far, either for yourself or for the public? I guess. For you, it seems like very profound and very significant, and it seems like it's such a personal project as well for yourself.
My life is different. I'm a different person. had started in, like we talked about COVID in the COVID years. So I've been a mariner, a marine surveyor. My background is technical, and I got sick on a job, and I had and it was fairly serious, and I had to change because I couldn't go back to sea with the condition that I had, and so this was a big change, and it came with a lot of life changes because, it pays very well to work on a ship for months and months and months.
Away from home.
Away from home, and you have a highly focused technical skill set that very few people have.
I pause you there for a moment. Even just like that significance of being out in the ocean, and significance of like ships bringing people into Canada, and just...
yeah, and I've worked in Africa, and like the first time you see Africa on the horizon, and it's hard to explain. Yeah. There was like me and another one of my black crewmates were just standing there on deck, like an hour before we even got there, just waiting, like, because it's that here we are, and that, like, I was young then, so I didn't understand where I fit into this network of blackness around the Atlantic Basin, and so I've been to all kinds of places and never saw myself there where I do now, and what I was getting at is I started to work on land, and because I slept in my own bed and I had a schedule that you could rely on, I'm like, I want to go and do a degree in history. And so I went to UNB. My advisor, Dr. Elizabeth Mankey, she sort of has been very, very nurturing in my career to make me do the right steps. And for me, COVID was, it was a challenge, but it also, so the 2 years of like, I can't go to my thesis study area. I spent that time reading a lot of stuff that I wouldn't have otherwise read. So I did a 4-year, 2-year program, but I didn't waste that time. And so judging by my engagement with my peers in academia, there is some people do recognize me as being knowledgeable and an original thinker in how we see our history, how we interpret it, and now through geocaching, how do we engage with it? How do we engage with community? Because academia does recognize, like, we see this stuff, we know the history, but if you turn on the news, you see this version that's not correct, and people are more than willing to just sort of go, oh, okay, that's because it places them in a colonial framework.
Right.
So professionally, within the city, my boss Greg Erickson was there today. They see like this vehicle for the city to engage in a way that doesn't require 100 new employees. Right. But for me professionally, it's also engaging with academia and other communities. I'm in a partnership with St. Mary's University right now with Dr. Carrie Lee Freeman that we are trying to take what we've done here in Fredericton and engage with black communities all over the region. And like I'd mentioned with you, it's like really any sort of marginalized community, and say, look, it's relatively barrier-free, low cost in the grand scheme of things. If you had a $5,000 grant, you could have a geocaching program with geocoins to last you. Yeah. The biggest expense is getting the tour established. But once that's done, you could work with other, like you could have BC's hidden histories, right? And then you work with all the communities and pool your funds together, and then you could have a multi-layered experience for people. So and I think we're just at the beginning. So my life for the next little while is going to be preaching the gospel of inclusion and clever ways to get community together.
Well, thank you for your work. What's
thank
next? You just kind of mentioned it. You hinted it a little bit. But
what's next? Well, I'm in a PhD program at UNB now, and that will be, it's very much parallel to what we're doing with the geocache. Like, the two feed each other. Mm-hmm. I'm looking at black presence in the Maritime provinces over space and time, and showing how the black community evolves and spreads out and changes based on What tends when we look at history now I'm talking about history, but for your non-white viewers who have some history in Canada, they'll recognize this and be like, oh yeah, okay. When we look at history, it's always sort of like white history, which is like the main history, and that's history, and then your history, which is like, oh, it's Filipino history,
Right.
or it's black history. And so it's like the things that drive the up and down of European population and economic stability, those also apply to everybody else. And in fact, it generally tends to drive our presence, right?
Yep.
Usually when things are ironically, when things are good for white people, they're bad for us. And when they're bad for white people, they're good for us, historically speaking. So, for me, the British losing the American Revolution, or having, during the war, needing the extra manpower and labor, meant that they were willing to accept and encourage enslaved Africans to join them. And so that led my ancestors to be free almost a century before their brethren who remained in the U.S. So my work will be to tell those stories and to view the historical sequence from a black perspective, but using historic documents, the archives, and space and time and community to say, like, look, we can see it here by people. So
one thing I forgot to ask you, you mentioned earlier in your presentation about the number of visitors and kind of the logs and stuff. What have people been saying about the tour?
It's been fairly positive. Well, it's all been positive. Like, no one said this sucks. I wish you hadn't done this. But there have been people who comment on, like, thanks for the history.
Right.
And that's the goal. Like, I think the Maritimer in me, like, we all sort of, we do tend to be like, hey, come on in, and we'll show you our culture and our community. There is that part of it that's like, have a look, see, and that community involves people who look like me too. And so there's that part. And then having people, I do hope that when people go to Salome's tub, that they do, like, you hear the fountain going, and you do take a second to just sort of go, like, 100 years ago, there was a black farmstead here, and these people were here. And Misha Gosman, who's the Canadian opera singer, that's her ancestors' farmland. And there's a story before that, and there's a story that will continue on. And now we have anchored it to something that, as long as the Geotour exists, people will be able to visit.
Great. Well, Graham, thank you for your work, and thanks for taking the time to
All right.
chat.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.